building next door, and we're leasing half of it. Half of it's our mental health counseling space, and the other half we're leasing to New Horizons Community Health Center, which is a federally qualified health center that provides health services on a sliding fee scale. So it's a beautiful partnership for our families, because many of our families obviously can't afford full fee at the doctor's office. So really excited about that. So any questions about the history?
And when did you become CEO? 96.
Yeah, 96, because it's been 20 years. That's right. Yeah. So it's funny, Denise, who's our new research associate, was in the office today, and my office is like a deli counter. I mean, people constantly coming and, asking, but first it's something about the finances, and then it's something about today's Run It Gives Big Day through Foundation. There's some emails not working, and Denise is sitting there trying to have a conversation with me about research, and she looked at me and she said, "How do you keep all that stuff in your head?" I said, "Well, 20 years, it's just, ingrained in there now." So, but that, that does present a problem for transition, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit too in terms of next steps for CHIP. I'm not going to live forever. I would do this forever, but we do need to start thinking about building that kind of capacity and that kind of internal knowledge base for the organization's future. So this is the structure of the organization as a whole. So as a nonprofit, we have committees that report to the board, and a lot of the work gets done in committee outside of the board structure. The board meets once a month, except for July and December, when attendance is really low, so we just decided to ditch those 2 months. But these committees all meet typically either monthly or quarterly. So lots and lots of meetings, and of course I staff all these committees. So what happens in committee can get voted on, and a motion can come from committee, and then it goes to the board, and then it just gets put on an action agenda item for the board meeting. So if the committee has fully discussed it and vetted it and has made a motion to approve it, then it moves through the board much faster. And we can save board time to discuss planning issues or other big issues that have come up.
Could we go just one more step deeper into that? So the board can hire and fire you, but they don't get involved in day-to-day operations and staffing issues and things like that. And because they're kind of responsible for having some grasp about what board of directors do, I would encourage you, because this is such a nice, nicely laid out sheet, to ask questions if you don't understand what those committees seem to describe, what they do.
This is less a question about committees, but how are your board of directors chosen?
Okay, good.
So there is a committee that is, and it's not on here, it's an appointed committee. These are not appointed committees, but it's a board governance committee. And the board governance committee meets usually around the first of the year about 3 times. They're responsible for looking at what kinds of areas we have represented. So do we need marketing or public relations expertise? Do we need a finance expertise? And we have kind of a grid that looks at all that. They also look at board member attendance. So if we have a board member who hasn't come to 60% of the meetings, we're going to call them up and say, maybe this isn't a good time for you, because we want to have an active board. And then that board governance committee does things like reviews the bylaws periodically, certainly not every year, but periodically, and looks at board leadership. So officers are board leadership. So you've got the chair, the vice chair, secretary, and treasurer. And typically, those folks make up an executive committee, so that if something happens that we need quick action on, and we don't have time to call the full board together, the board is 25 members. Then you've got a committee that can sprint on that, which is the executive committee.
So the executive committee handles emergencies.
Well, as they come up, yes, or not necessarily emergencies, but if you have, I'm on another board, and this just pops to mind, like an increase in the lease that just suddenly came up that they weren't expecting, and that we pulled the executive committee together for that. The executive committee is responsible for doing my review annually. And so I have 25 bosses because really I report to the full board. So if a board member wants something or they're not happy about something, I jump. I make sure that I get to the bottom of what they need. But the board does one performance evaluation on me, and then the executive committee does a little bit more in-depth evaluation, and then they come together without me, the executive committee, and discusses that and decides, what my compensation is going to be.
And then can you talk a little bit about the healthcare advisory committee, what that is? Because the other ones I think are more self-explanatory, but does that focus on healthcare issues or?
Yeah, so there's something called ad hoc committees of the board and then standing committees of the board. And so the standing committees are like finance committee. You're required to have a finance committee, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. You have to have a finance and audit committee. Development committee, standing committee, executive committee, long-range planning. The healthcare advisory committee and the marketing committee are ad hoc. But they're one of the most highly functioning committees that we have. It's comprised of all pediatricians and dentists, nurse practitioners, who come together quarterly. We measure over 50 outcomes now. Things like 90% of our children are fully immunized, 90% of our children are up to date on their well baby visits. Number of parents who miss work for asthma exacerbation, just all kinds of outcomes. So they look at that list of outcomes and how we achieved our goals. And if we didn't achieve them, why? And we have to have an explanation. Well, we know why these 3 kids went to kindergarten and didn't have their immunizations. It was because either there were medical reasons or mom's fear and we couldn't get around that or whatever. So it holds us accountable. And then that committee, every committee does a board report after they meet. So there's typically a board member that serves, many board members that serve on each committee, and then the chair of that committee does the report to the board. And that's one way to make the board meetings engaging and get the board members engaged in the board meeting. This other board that I was telling you that I'm on, unfortunately the executive director talks the whole meeting. And you can just see people kind of zoning out, and it's so helpful to get that engagement from everybody so that they are invested in it and they know they're going to be on the agenda and they're going to be responsible for facilitating that discussion. So this is our organizational structure. CHIP is very flat in terms of the organizational structure. We don't have a whole lot of supervisory staff. So you can see I report to the board. I have 9 direct reports: the Director of Family Services, Nursing and Training, Mental Health, Director of Finance, Research, Executive Assistant, Special Events, Major Gifts, and QA Quality Assurance all report to me. And then each of these directors have their direct reports. So the Family Support has 11 family case managers, and she also supervises the van drivers and the office managers. Nursing, the community health nurses and the team secretary, and then mental health, the There's a team that are behavioral health case managers. They are QMHPs, which is qualified mental health. She supervises them and the counselor, the finance director for the finance assistant. Ideally, when we go through the strategic planning and we start to put some infrastructure in place, this organizational chart will shift a lot because I shouldn't be supervising 9 people and doing all the other things that I do. So ideally, we should really have all of these development people under a director of development who would be overseeing that function. And right now, I'm kind of functioning as a director of development. This quality assurance person will probably go under a COO, Chief Operations Officer. And then the COO will probably take on some of the program director piece. But as we grow as an organization, you can see why that infrastructure is so important. I mean, I have to meet with all those people at least an hour or 2 a month to help guide them and help them feel supported. And so in order for them to do the best job they can, they need that infrastructure and that support. Are there any questions about this org chart?
I have a question. Do you anticipate any either positive or negative impact on your organizational culture when you sort of make it more hierarchical of an organization?
I think it could, it's not going to be a deli counter anymore. People are probably going to have to go through the chief operations officer for a lot of things, and they're not going to be used to that. But I think it's going to be imperative that we set it up the right way. And maybe we'll go to the next slide because part of what I wanted to talk about a little bit was the organizational culture itself. And so if we set that person up in a way that they meet all their direct reports, kind of hear what their issues and concerns are, and then we have something called process improvement teams, PITs is what we call them, that we pull together whenever we have an issue that we need input on, whether it's the data management system feels too cumbersome or transportation just isn't working, then we'll pull together a PIT. So I think that's going to be an essential thing for her, is to figure out what the main issues are and then to pull together PITs that can help to problem solve these things. And if she can get her staff to be the solution and not the problem, it's going to change how the whole culture feels. One of the things that we always struggle with, and we are such a family-oriented culture, but is communication. Just making sure that, sometimes I'm just shocked because I think I just communicate everything. I put it out there at a staff meeting. I've got going over the financial statements. I'm talking about everything I'm doing, all the meetings I've had, and all this and that that's going on. And I'm looking around the room and people are just kind of glazing over. I'm like, so I was talking to Denise, who's my new research associate, about that, and she's done some research around organizational culture and some other things, and she said, I think staff just don't get how it applies to them. You've got to change the way you're messaging. Communication is just so key. She said, instead of going through all the grants that we've done and who's been funded and what's pending, she said, I was sitting there taking notes and really excited about all that. But I looked around the room and everybody was just kind of rolling their eyes. And she said, I think if you could say, so we applied to this foundation and it's going to fund 3 nurses' salaries and the what to do with asthma books, and, and present it that way, people would understand, oh, this really does pertain to me. It's not just you doing your job, but it's all of us figuring this out together and how it all comes together to make an organization work. Long answer, but that was a really good question. So I was trying to think about what our organizational culture looks like and kind of talk through the way that I see it, which is we're very innovative. And I'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each of these as I go through them. So we're always looking for ways to better help families, improve our processes like through our PITs, and measure what's working. And that's a great thing for the families because we're going to continue to be a dynamic organization and change and grow and do what's right for the families because the environment shifts all the time. You can't just stay stagnant and do the same thing. However, what that does is it creates constant change for staff, and that is hard for people. You know, oh, well, we've discovered that this assessment isn't working, and we're going to now do this protective factors survey, and you know, you need to give that to the family. Or now we're going to do a screening for autism. Well, that's more paperwork. You know, that we're seeing so much more autism now. So, you know, it's great to be innovative, but you've got to kind of temper that with constantly looking at what you're throwing at staff and how much paperwork and how many new programs and listening. Is this too much? And or are there other ways that we could streamline this to make it more palatable for everyone? Otherwise, you're going to have a system breakdown at some point. Detail-oriented, lots of quality assurance. We have a full-time quality assurance coordinator who looks at the data that goes into the computer. If we're going to use it for research, what comes out of it is going to be really important, so what goes into it is vitally important. You know, always looking at the documentation and making sure that the assessments are complete, so the supervisors and every supervision are, I see that so-and-so hasn't had a health assessment this quarter, or I see that, you know, this. So there's a balance in trying to make sure that we've got everything we need to make sure that we're doing quality work, but to not make the staff feel like Big Brother is watching and, you know, they're feeling like, you don't want them to feel like, oh, I can never do anything right. You know, you want to approach it in a way that they see the value in collecting the information in the way that we need it. Outcomes oriented, I mentioned that we use laptops in the homes. You know, some people are comfortable, some aren't. We are always looking, every month, we look at how many families were referred, how many got enrolled, what's going on, you know, why are only a third of the families enrolling this month? Was it the marketing message? Is it the way we're presenting? You know, just constantly looking at everything. Discharge numbers, making sure that, you know, every discharge is signed off on, and that we don't just have really difficult cases that we want to discharge, but, you know, there's a process for vetting all those. Always looking at home visit numbers. So, you know, because that's what our funders are looking at. And for some grants, we get reimbursed on a cost per child basis. But so you've got a staff member over here who just discharged 10 kids for kindergarten entry, and all of a sudden her caseload drops and her supervisor is going to be saying, all right, you know, you need to do enrollments. When are you going to get those enrollments? You know, so it's a constant balance to try to make sure that everybody's feeling good about the work and they understand that you feel good about their work, but we as an organization are a team and have to meet certain criteria. Which is where the people-oriented thing sometimes gets in the way, because we are very family-friendly. That's a beautiful thing. I think it's one of the things that makes our organization run so well. We care about the people that work for us, just like they care about the families that they serve. And, you know, whenever I hear a little bit of infighting or whatever, I'll look at that person and say, can you give her the grace that you give your families? Because, you know, we need to think that way. I think we can be so hard on each other, but then so tolerant of meeting the families where they are. So we always strive to treat each other with dignity and respect. I mean, we're not perfect beings, and obviously all of us fail at that at certain times, but trying to create that culture where you're doing sunshine baskets for somebody who ended up in the hospital, and you're really coming together as a whole team when crisis hits one of our staff members. And listening to their input and valuing their input. Again, those process improvement teams and RNFCM meetings and interdisciplinary team meetings we're having, and you guys are going to be coming to a lot of meetings, but and development team meetings, but just, giving time to process, to communicate, to hear what everybody's doing, to ask questions. That's, I think, what makes it very team and people oriented. And just the very function and nature of CHIP is team-oriented. There are 4 teams. There's 1 nurse and 3 case managers to a team. So there are those 4 teams. And then there is what we call a BHIP team, which is behavioral health innovation. And those are the children who have behavioral health issues or families. And they have a qualified mental health professional, but still do the same work as the other teams, but that's a team. And then we've got the counseling team. It's only 2 people, but they're working as a team because one sees the mom, one sees the child, and they're having to make sure that they're on the same page. Then we've got a development team. So it's that major gifts person and me and the grant writer and the events person. We're meeting monthly as a team to talk about what everybody's doing and make sure we're not asking the same people or stepping on each other's toes and supporting each other in what we're doing. And then there's that big team as a staff. I think that there is a culture that, we're not a perfect culture, that's for sure. There are sometimes issues between upstairs and downstairs. And that's because just by the layout of the building, the downstairs is where all the people that run in and out all day for home visits are. And upstairs is where all the administrative staff is. So that naturally kind of creates a divide in the culture of what do they do upstairs all day? And we're not interacting, with them, like except at events and in meetings and that sort of thing. So it is work to create that team culture and keep it going, and it still isn't perfect. We still have a lot of lessons to learn around that. I think probably every organization struggles with that, and that's communication. And then collaborative versus competitive. So what I mean by that is figuring out how to partner, to your question, how to partner with other organizations to make sure that the services are as complete as they can be. We can't be all things to all people. So if we can't do GED tutoring, who in town does that we could partner with to make sure that we have a stream open to our moms? We are not a medical home for parents or for children. So who can we partner with to make sure that our moms can get into a doctor if they need it and our children have a medical home? Just recently, with my research associate, we're looking at a partnership or collaboration with Virginia Tech Curriculum Research Institute. She was a chair of a department of psychology, so she's worked with a lot of students and done a lot of wonderful research projects with her students. So now we're thinking, well, this is a win-win. The medical students could have a placement at CHIP, get a research experience, which is part of their curriculum. She could coach them, teach them. They could publish a poster or, even a journal article. And so that's a real win-win. We get research, she gets help, and the student gets mentoring and a really valuable learning experience. So always kind of thinking about people that we meet. Well, is there a partnership or is there some kind of collaboration or something there that would work for everybody? So the weakness in the organizational culture, and I spoke to this a little bit as I was going through, is that cross-functional collaboration. Not a lot of that. there is upstairs where all the administrative work is taking place, because development sees the financial picture, and obviously I do, and the research person. But downstairs, they're just very busy serving families. They're busy processing the trauma that they saw that day, or talking over with their supervisor, and really are kind of clueless. And so joining those cultures is a real weakness that we're working on. And I'm really hoping that if I get a COO in place, I can hire the right person that could really facilitate some of that, because honestly, there are just not enough hours in the day for me to run around and, talk to 40 people and get to know their families and supervise my 9 people and be out in the community and raise 610,000. I mean, it's just not enough hours in the day. So we need that function. That's going to be very, very helpful to us. Organizational challenges, and this was kind of to your question, Melissa, about where do we see ourselves going next. Funding streams are always unstable. I alluded to that earlier. You just never know. We've got a $260,000 grant that's coming up. That is one of our biggest sources of funding, and we just got the RFP last night, and it said expansion funds. You can't just do what you've done, you have to expand. Well, oh, come on, give me a break, we need to do some other things before we expand. So that, always trying to shift your thinking on how to make that happen. I think one of the things that worries me a lot is we get about $400,000 from Medicaid managed care for case managing kids with asthma and doing a lot of those medical things. And now managed care is starting to hire their own nurse case managers. They see us as competition and not as a resource. So that's an interesting shift, and that could cost us a lot of money. And so it's my job to run to Richmond and make everybody feel good about what they're investing in, because it's important that they see the difference between a nurse phone call and a nurse who has a relationship with the family month to month to month. It's a whole different ball of wax. So staff turnover, it's so costly to an organization to have staff turnover. So it's worth investing in building your organizational culture and your communication style. And really, we had one family case manager position that we hired this year, and she stayed for 3 months and decided it wasn't for her. But we had just invested 3 full months of training in her. She wasn't even serving a caseload yet, So then you have to rehire and re-advertise, and it's so hard on the families. They develop a relationship with somebody, and you want them to be there for them for a while. And just from an organizational culture standpoint, it's hard to build that feeling of family if you're having constant turnover. The good news is we don't have constant turnover. We have one position we're having a hard time with, but it's pretty low. And then I think our other huge weakness is just in marketing. We just hired this year a gal that has great social media experience, and she's really getting us out there on social media. But the name Chip, there are so many chips. If you Google Chip, you'll come up with a whole lot of stuff. And I don't think it means anything to anybody. People don't really know what that is. So we struggle with that as a board, and are really looking at, do we need to rebrand? Do we need to keep that name but just do a new campaign? What should we do about that piece? Our future plans to become evidence-based, which I started out with, but obviously that's really on my mind. There are some huge federal dollars, so from my point of view as running the organization, there's a lot of money coming into evidence-based home visiting programs. The nation Obama, even Governor